Officer Greg Doyle slammed 17-year-old Jordan Miles face first onto a rain-slicked police car, barking accusations of drugs and weapons he didn't have. Pinned and breathless, Jordan chose silence, clinging to his father's lesson: stay calm, let the law speak. Then a low, urgent siren rolled through the dark streets, an unmistakable sound that meant someone with real authority was seconds away. Could Justice Malcolm Miles reach his son before this stop spiraled into something far worse? Hit like and share this story to spread the fight for dignity and justice. Now follow us into the night where it all unfolded. I remember the air first, a thin, needling rain that made the streetlights bleed gold across the pavement. Washington nights can be loud even when they're quiet. That one hummed low and steady like the city had set itself to idle. I was halfway down Maple under a shallow stoop when I noticed the kid. Jordan Miles, 17, maybe slim backpack, hood up just enough to catch the drizzle. He floated through a sax line coming off his headphones, that slow, late-hour kind of music you wear like a coat. He walked like he had a warm kitchen to reach and time to get there. The block felt safe enough to forget itself. Then the quiet cracked. A siren tore the air, too close, too sudden, and red and blue sliced across the wet street. A cruiser swung in hard and stopped nose first to the curb. Jordan flinched. He pulled one earbud free, turned halfway the way polite kids do when they think a horn means my mistake. He didn't get a full word out. The driver's door banged open. A big officer climbed down fast, coat dark, with rain jaw clenched like he meant to hold the whole scene inside his teeth. Officer Greg Doyle. He didn't drift. He advanced 3 heavy steps and a flashlight beamed straight to the kid's face. Hands where I can see them now. It wasn't loud so much as final. The kind of command that closes every other door in the room. Jordan froze and lifted his hands, palms open. Peace plain as day. Close up, he looked younger than 17 and older than he should have to be. His fingers trembled just a little. Rain stitched a fine pattern on the cruiser's hood. The light hovered on his cheekbones, turned the mist into glitter. Where are you coming from? Doyle fired before Jordan could swallow. Any weapons, any drugs? The question snapped out like a drill he knew by heart. When the wind turned, I caught a sour thread of tobacco and liquor. It sat heavy in the space between them, made the air feel shorter. Jordan drew a breath like he'd practiced it. Sir, did I ask you to talk? Doyle cut him off, beam lifting a shade. Backpack, on the ground. Jordan's eyes flicked down, then back up. He knelt a little, set the bag down with both hands, the way you handle something that matters. He straightened. You could see him reach for something inward, like a handhold you can't see, but know is there. Stay calm. Never let anger choose your words. It was in the way his shoulders leveled, in the slow count of his breath. Sir, I'm coming from study group, he said softer. Lincoln High. My mom. Turn around, Doyle said. Hands on the hood. Jordan obeyed. He turned, placed his palms on the cold metal. The hood hissed under the rain. Doyle stepped in close. I saw the cords in his neck stand like wires. What's in the bag? He pressed. Books. A laptop. Jordan didn't look back. No weapons. Doyle leaned in too near, voice low and rasping. Kids like you always say that. A second-story curtain blinked. A lit rectangle rose, someone's phone already recording. Another neighbor stepped out beneath a porch light. Nobody shouted yet. Nobody scattered. The city felt like it had stopped just long enough to listen. I don't want trouble, Jordan said. The officer didn't answer. His hand snapped to the kid's wrist and yanked it higher between his shoulder blades. The motion made a small, sharp sound, flesh fabric metal, then a thin clack as the flashlight rolled and tapped a tire. Jordan's breath fogged the hood and smeared away under the rain. Spread your feet, Doyle barked. Jordan did. His shoes squeaked a fraction. His eyes pinched closed, then opened and fixed on nothing I could see. Maybe a living room couch, a mother at a stove, a father's voice across a table. He held himself as if one careless inch might cost him more than he owned. From a window, a woman's voice shook and steadied. Officer, please, he's a child. Mrs. Howard, 2 doors down, phone in one hand, the sill gripped in the other. Mind your business, Doyle said without looking up. Then louder to Jordan, who are you meeting? Where do you keep it? My study group, Jordan managed. Sir, I don't move. The pat-down was fast and indifferent, the way you do something you've done 1,000 times and never learned to do kindly. Water pooled on the kid's sleeves and ran in threads toward his elbows. The backpack zipper rasped open. A history book thumped. A notebook bent. A laptop sleeve slid and stopped against the tire. Doyle tossed the bag back down harder than he needed, the splash loud for how small it was. "Where's the dope?" he said. "There isn't any." Jordan's voice thinned, but it didn't splinter. Pressure, not anger. "I haven't done anything." He said it like a fact you could lay your hand on. No drama, no plea. A line set on clean ground. 4 phones were up now. The reflections jumped on the wet blacktop. You could feel the tilt of the street shift half a degree, only half, but you feel half when you're standing on it. Doyle pressed him down another inch. The hood sang a faint metallic complaint. A bus hissed at the far corner and rolled on. A door clicked shut somewhere behind me. The city kept being the city, but the center of Maple Street had narrowed to a badge, and the breath between what happens and what should happen. "Please," Jordan said, eyes open. Voice steadier than mine. "Call my father." The officer's mouth twitched into something that didn't land as a smile. "What's Daddy gonna do?" Jordan didn't answer. He didn't have to. He held the line the way you grip a rail in a storm knuckles' white feet set, mind fixed on the next right breath. Rain ticked. Lights turned. And in that tight, rain-bright silence, his last words didn't just sound true, they stood there. "I haven't done anything." I watched Doyle lean in until his mouth was almost at the boy's ear. The rain threaded down the brim of his cap and fell in a steady tick on Jordan's shoulder. When he spoke, his voice flattened the space between them. "Another gang kid out late." It wasn't curiosity. It was a label pressed on like a bruise. I felt heat climb the back of my neck. Jordan didn't twist away. He held the hood fingers, splayed breath, going in measured counts you could see in the fog on the metal. A sash scraped upstairs. A window flew up hard enough to rattle. "Hey, Mrs. Laverne, Howard Widow Choir." Alto 2 doors down, had both elbows on the sill and a phone already in her hand. Her voice shook and then steadied. "Let that boy go." Doyle's head snapped toward the sound. His left hand drifted casual but not casual toward the butt of his holster. He didn't draw. He didn't need to. "Mind your own business," he said, turning his shoulders just enough that we could all see where that hand rested, "or you'll join him." The block inhaled and held it. You could feel fear thicken the air, how it makes a crowd quiet, how it makes people choose the doorway over the street. But phones still came up. One on the stoop across from me, another near the corner store. I heard a soft curse and the quick patter of slippers on wood as someone else stepped out into the drizzle. Jordan's jaw tightened. I can't tell you what moved behind his eyes in that second. All I can tell you is what I saw. He steadied himself the way a person reaches for a rule that saved them before. Shoulders down, chin level, a breath that had a number to it. If you've ever watched a child remember a lesson at the exact moment they need it, you know the shape it makes in their face. He didn't shout. He didn't yank free. He said low and clear, "Please call my father." The words surprised me more than the siren had. Not because they were defiant, but because of how settled they sounded, like he'd already decided the road he was going to walk, no matter how the street tilted. Doyle gave a small, ugly laugh that didn't quite make it to his eyes. "What's Daddy gonna do?" He wanted it to be a punchline. He wanted us to hear nothing but mockery. But I was close enough to catch the flicker, quick as a blink, of something else running under his gaze. A question he hadn't meant to ask. The crowd felt it too. The murmurs shifted. "Who's his father?" He said father, not mom. "Who is he?" "I know that kid, he goes to Lincoln." Honor roll. Phones multiplied. Light bounced off the wet street, turned the rain to points of fire. Mrs. Howard's voice came strong from above. "Keep filming names and badges." You could tell she'd been waiting her whole life for a sentence like that to come out of her mouth with no tremor. Doyle squared himself again, angling his body to block the nearest cameras from catching the holster. "Hands stay where they are," he warned Jordan, closer, softer. His lips barely moved. "You move, you get hurt." Jordan didn't move. His knuckles whitened and then let go of the tension a fraction. He found his breath again. He found the cadence that belonged to him, not to the night. Later, much later, I'd learn what ran through his mind When he chose silence, a story his father told at the kitchen table about a stop years back. The way the officer's flashlight had climbed his father's face without ever finding anything illegal. The way the law, when you knew it and held yourself to it, could be both armor and witness. Silence can protect your dignity, his father had said. Back then on Maple Street, all I had to go on was the way Jordan made that sentence visible. Officer Mrs. Howard called steadier. Now we have eyes on this from 3 houses. Don't do something you can't take back. Ma'am Doyle said, still not looking up. You're interfering with a lawful stop. Lawful looks different when the whole block is watching, she answered. The choir alto was back. She didn't raise her voice. She made it carry. Across the street, a man in pajama pants lifted his phone and named the date and time, the intersection, the officer's badge number. Someone else repeated it for the record. The rain wasn't heavy, but it made everything sharp. It made seconds feel like pennies dropped in a jar, one after another, counting us towards something none of us could see. Last chance, Doyle muttered to Jordan, as if the boy had been bargaining. Tell me where it is. There isn't anything to tell, Jordan said. His voice had thinned earlier. Now it widened, not louder, just fuller, like a chord opening under a melody. I haven't done anything. He didn't look back when he said it. He kept his eyes on the blank black of the windshield, on his own reflection, cut by rain. The sentence didn't ask permission. It didn't ask belief. It occupied the space between them and didn't give it back. Somewhere a cruiser whispered through a cross street and kept going. Somewhere else a baby cried and then quieted. The city kept its own weather, but here under the streetlight, under the phones, under the rain, the physics began to tilt. Not enough to topple a man, not yet. Enough for everyone to feel their feet adjust. Let him breathe, a voice said behind me. I turned just enough to clock the faces, the corner store cashier in his apron, the mailman in a hoodie, a teenager with a pizza box held against the rain like a shield. No one stepped closer. Everyone stayed present. Doyle's cheeks flushed a shade deeper. He leaned in so close I thought Jordan could taste his breath. You think your father's going to fix this? Jordan swallowed. I think I'm going to do what he taught me. And what's that? Another breath? Another count. Stand still. Tell the truth. Stay alive. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the rain ticking on the hood. You could almost hear the balance of the moment making up its mind. Phones arced higher. The light jumped again. Someone whispered, "Who is his father?" and someone else answered. We're about to find out, like a promise and a prayer. Doyle rolled his shoulders once, like he was pushing the night back into its place. His hand stayed by the holster. His weight stayed forward. But his eyes, just for a second, flicked past us down the street where Maple bends out of view, as if some part of him had heard the same low-distant sound the rest of us were pretending we hadn't noticed yet. Jordan didn't turn. He couldn't. He didn't need to. He had already chosen his side of the line, the quiet, stubborn kind that doesn't try to win the room, only refuses to surrender it. He kept his hands where they were. He kept his words to the ones that mattered. And in the glow of a dozen little screens, with a neighborhood gathered and the night drawing a tight circle around us, his silence stopped feeling like absence. It felt like resistance, and it held. I remember the way the night seemed to hold its breath after that last exchange. Rain slid down the cruiser's windshield, gathering in little rivers that caught the glow of every phone light. Jordan stayed motionless, his palms flat on the hood, while Officer Doyle hovered over him like a shadow with a pulse. Up above Mrs. Laverne, Howard finally moved. I saw her pull back from the sill just long enough to dial. This is an emergency, she told 911, voice trembling but precise. Officer Greg Doyle is detaining a minor forcefully on Maple and 5th. No resistance from the boy. He's using unnecessary force. We need another unit here right now. She gave the address twice, each word firmer than the last. Even from where I stood, I could hear the steel settle into her tone. Blocks away in a warm kitchen lined with case files and framed diplomas, Elaine Miles felt her phone buzz. She answered on instinct, and Mrs. Howard's urgent report came through quick and clear. For a heartbeat, Elaine listened only to the sound of rain in the background and the distant strain in her neighbor's voice. Then a second call, Jordan's number, lit up the screen. She pressed accept without a breath. Mom Jordan's voice came through low but steady. She could hear the wet pavement in it, could almost smell the metal of the cruiser. I'm okay, please don't panic. Her heart clenched hard enough to hurt, but her voice stayed even. Stay calm, son. We're with you. Remember what Dad and I told you. Stay still, speak only when you must. Every word came out like a lifeline, knotted by years of practice. Not far across town, in a marble-walled conference room of the Supreme Court Justice, Malcolm Miles was reviewing late briefs when Elaine's call broke through. He saw his wife's name and the urgency in the double ring, and the room around him narrowed to a single point. He didn't wait for a full explanation. I'm on my way, he said, already rising. Papers slid from his lap to the polished floor as he grabbed his coat. Security barely had time to open the door before Malcolm was in the hallway. In the echoing garage below, a black government SUV waited with its engine warm. The driver, startled by the speed of his passenger, threw a quick look over his shoulder as Malcolm climbed in. Maple and Fifth, Malcolm ordered. Now! The engine growled alive, deep and deliberate, the sound of something official and unstoppable. Within moments, that low siren, distinct from any city patrol, rolled over the sleeping blocks. It wasn't loud in the way of an ambulance. It was lower, heavier, a signal you felt in your chest. Heads turned on porches 2 streets away. The people gathered around us caught it first as a vibration, then as a question whispered from one neighbor to the next. Jordan heard it too. He stayed pinned, cheek close to the metal, but I saw the slight lift of his shoulders, a breath that almost looked like relief. The corner of his mouth softened just enough to be seen. He knew that sound the way you know a familiar footstep in a dark hall. His father was coming. Seconds, not minutes, stood between them now. What's that? Someone near the curb murmured. Another answered before the first echo faded. That's not a DC cruiser. That's federal. The words carried sparking new whispers. Phones tilted toward the curve of Maple where the street bent out of sight. A man in a rain jacket said, "Sounds like Supreme Court transport." A woman nearby replied, "No way. Not at this hour." But her voice wavered as the low thrum grew clearer. Beside the cruiser, a younger officer shifted his weight. I noticed the flick of his eyes toward Doyle, then toward the distant sound. His fingers twitched at his side in decision, written in every small movement. "Sir, maybe we should," he began. Doyle's head whipped around, his jaw set. "Stay back. I'm in charge." The command cracked like a whip. The younger man froze, but the doubt didn't leave his face. The rain fell harder for a beat, as if to underline the tension. We stood there, neighbors, strangers, witnesses, listening to the steady advance of that unmistakable engine, all of us aware that the night had just shifted. What began as a single officer's stop was now something larger, pulled into motion by a power none of us could see yet, but every one of us could feel coming down the street. I can still feel how the night tightened in on itself as the sound of that low siren crept closer. By then the street had filled out. Neighbors spilled from doorways and stoops, some with umbrellas, most with phones lit like small torches. Their screens threw pale squares across the wet asphalt, turning puddles into patches of silver. The soft hiss of rain mixed with an undercurrent of voices, questions, gasps, the quick exchange of badge numbers and street names. The air carried a hum, part fear and part defiance. Officer Doyle seemed to bristle against that gathering light. He yanked Jordan's backpack from the curb and unzipped it hard enough to pop the seam. A heavy history book slapped onto the ground. Then a laptop in a black sleeve slid out and skidded a few feet before stopping with a flat splash. Pages of loose notes scattered like startled birds. He didn't ask permission. He didn't announce a warrant. He dug and tossed and let the contents land where they would, as if the chaos itself were evidence. Jordan didn't flinch. He didn't lunge for the papers or twist toward the laptop. He stood exactly where he'd been, palms pressed to the cruiser's dripping hood, the rain drawing slow lines down his forearms. He inhaled once, steady and deep, and fixed his eyes on Doyle. No words, no plea, just that stillness that carried more weight than shouting ever could. It was as if the silence had shape, pressing back at the officer's every rough motion. You could sense the crowd feeling it too, the strength of a boy who refused to be dragged into the noise. Behind Doyle, the younger officer shifted his boots on the slick street. He took a single step forward, maybe to speak, maybe to intervene. "Sir," maybe he started, but Doyle spun arm, cutting the air like a blade. "Stay back." The bark of those 2 words cracked louder than the siren for a moment. The younger man froze mid-step, his jaw tight, and something unspoken passed between them. An argument without sound, a crack in the chain of command visible to every watching phone. Then the other sound rose low at first, then carrying the deep thrum of an engine built for authority, the unmistakable bass of a federal vehicle. It wasn't the jittery whoop of city cruisers. This was heavier, slower, a sound you feel in your chest. The murmur of the crowd shifted to a ripple of realization. "That's not local police," someone near me said. "That's a federal convoy," another voice answered. A few people said it outright, like a chorus that needed no rehearsal. "It's the Supreme Court vehicle. It's coming here." The thought seemed to widen the space around us, even as bodies pressed closer. Every phone swung toward the corner, where Maple Ben's waiting for the first flash of headlights. The drizzle caught the light and turned it to glitter in the air. Mrs. Howard leaned farther out her window rain, matting her gray hair, phone still steady. "Keep filming. Don't let them hide this," she called. Her words cut through the night, strong and urgent. Neighbors echoed her "keep filming." The chant rolled down the block until it felt like part of the storm itself. Jordan lifted his chin a fraction, not to look, he couldn't, but to listen. In the deepening quiet between the siren's pulses, he seemed to hear more than the rest of us. The distant engine beat aligned with the pulse in his throat. He knew that sound. You could see it in the way his shoulders eased just slightly, and the way his breath slowed to meet the rhythm. Whatever came next, he understood it was already on its way. I stood there, rain soaking through my coat, watching a single boy hold his ground while a city block held its breath. Every second stretched long enough to feel every sound sharpened to a point: the drip from a gutter, the faint buzz of a street lamp, the deliberate growl of a vehicle closing the distance. And in the center of it all, Jordan's silence stayed unbroken, unyielding, as the moment we all knew was about to arrive. The SUV came in low and hard brakes, whispering on the wet curb, as if it had been aimed from blocks away at this exact square of street. The driver's door flew open before the engine settled. A tall man stepped down, no coat, just a plain shirt rolled at the wrist, rain pinning the fabric to his frame. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. People moved without being told, a human tide parting in the light. Justice Malcolm Miles walked straight toward the cruiser, like the shortest distance between 2 points was all the time the night would give him. For a heartbeat, even the weather seemed to go still. The rain kept falling, but softer, like it was listening. Phones hovered in midair, their screens bright and shaking. Someone behind me whispered, "That's him," and the words ran through the crowd like an electric wire. Jordan didn't turn, he couldn't, but his shoulders told on him. A small lift, a held breath, the kind of stillness that isn't frozen, it's braced. Malcolm stopped at the edge of the hood, close enough to see the fog of his son's breath on the metal. He took in the scene once the bag dumped out, the pages sticking to the street, the officer's hand too near the holster, and the temperature of the block seemed to reset around him. "Release my son," 3 words. Laid down like a gavel. Not shouted, declared. The syllables landed in the rain with the force of things that don't need to ask. Doyle's chin hitched, as if he'd been waiting his whole career to meet a man who spoke to him like that and had already practiced not liking it. "And who exactly are you?" The question tried for steady but frayed at the tail, a thread pulled too fast. Malcolm didn't blink. He reached into his inside pocket with a deliberateness that made the air between us widen and brought out a slender leather wallet, official, unadorned. He opened it, turned it not just to Doyle, but to the black glass of a dozen phones, the small gold seal catching and throwing every drop of light. Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He didn't add his name. He didn't list his chambers. He let the office speak for itself. The crowd didn't cheer at first, it gasped. Then something let go. A wave rolled down the block. Voices, relief, disbelief, a dozen different kinds of yes. Screens surged higher. You could hear words being typed as fast as thumbs could move. "Justice for Jordan," someone said out loud as if reading from a teleprompter, and within seconds you could hear it repeated by people who hadn't met before tonight. "It's live," a teenager near the bodega said, eyes wet and bright. "It's all live." Doyle's hand stayed at Jordan's shoulder, a breath too long. "Sir, this is a lawful stop," he managed the title scraped thin in his mouth. "Then you'll have no trouble respecting the law," Malcolm said, calm as a courtroom. "Take your hands off my son. Step back. Now." Something in the line of Doyle's jaw twitched. His eyes slid just for a moment to the ring of lenses, tracking his every choice. He eased his grip the smallest fraction, as if permission were a ration he could afford only a sip at a time. Then he stepped back. Not far. Just enough that air returned to the space where his authority had been standing too close. Jordan's palm stayed on the hood. He didn't move until his father said, "Jordan." Not a question, not even a command. A name spoken with both edges, love and law. The boy lifted his hands a few inches off the metal and let them hover there, as if asking the night if it would hold. "Face me," Malcolm said softer now. Jordan turned. The rain had combed his hair, flat against his forehead. His eyes were wide and steady, and then not steady at all. He saw his father fully, not the office, not the seal, but the man who had taught him a dozen breakfasts worth of rules that most boys never get told, because most boys should never need them. Behind Malcolm, the crowd swelled tighter and safer at once. A choir's worth of phones panned and refocused. I heard someone on a live stream narrate through tears, "His father's a Supreme Court justice. This is Maple and Fifth. This is happening right now." The words slid past the rain and lodged somewhere under my ribs. Doyle rallied, but only to the tune of bureaucracy. For the record, he said we had reasonable suspicion. "No," Malcolm said gently, and the word was an iron bar laid across a doorway. "You had an assumption." "They're not the same thing." He glanced once at the younger officer, just a glance, and something like shame flickered across the man's face. The chain of command didn't break. It softened. It remembered there was a city watching. A sedan pulled up fast and braked hard. Elaine Miles climbed out before it finished rocking. No umbrella, no preamble. She went straight for her son, arms, wrapping him in that particular kind of embrace that measures injuries with fingertips, even as it forgives the world for being what it is. "You held on, baby," she whispered, voice shaking and then settling. "I'm proud of you." Jordan's breath hitched. He pressed his face to her shoulder for 1 second, then lifted it, because the moment wasn't just theirs. His eyes found his father's again. You could see the understanding move between them, not "we're safe, not yet," but "we are not alone on this street. The law is here, and it has a voice." Around us, the night changed shape. It didn't soften into comfort. It sharpened into clarity. Hashtags multiplied on screens. I saw "Done Sugar Justice for Jordan," now run "Fourth Amendment," non Maple and Fifth scroll like a ticker in a dozen hands. People announced the time, the badge numbers, the location. Names were repeated not as threats but as facts. Facts stack. Facts stand. Malcolm stepped just enough to put himself between Jordan and Doyle without making a show of it. "Officer," he said, "you will account for your actions, and you will do so on camera. For now, you will step back, holster your hand, and wait for supervisory support." It wasn't theater. It was procedure spoken by someone who knew it better than the night did. Doyle swallowed. You could hear it even over the rain. He took another small step back. The younger officer's shoulders dropped a notch, not out of relief exactly, but out of recognition. The road they were on had signs again. Elaine brushed rain from Jordan's cheek with her thumb. He blinked, and in that blink, the steel in him and the boy in him took turns in his face. He wasn't shaking anymore. He was present. He was held. I realized I had been holding my own breath and let it go. The siren idled somewhere behind the SUV, a steady promise instead of a threat. The neighborhood leaned in not to gawk, but to witness, which is its own kind of protection. And standing there soaked through and wired with adrenaline, I watched a simple thing happen that the night had refused us until now. Power arrived, and it didn't ask to be obeyed. It asked to be accountable. Jordan looked from his mother to his father and then to the phones surrounding them, and something like gratitude crossed his face. Gratitude not just for family, but for a world where the truth, when it is finally spoken aloud, doesn't need to shout to be heard. The moment Malcolm Miles finished speaking, the block felt different, like the air itself had decided to listen. Rain ticked along the cruiser's roof, but the sound was background now. All eyes stayed fixed on the man who'd just declared his title and taken back the night. Malcolm stepped closer until the wet pavement reflected his face beneath the streetlight. He didn't raise his voice. He simply locked eyes with Officer Doyle and said, slow and precise, "Under the Fourth Amendment, you need probable cause. Show it. Now." The words landed like stone. For a second, even Doyle seemed to forget the weight of his own badge. His mouth worked, but the answer was thin. Suspicious behavior. He began the phrase, collapsing before it could stand. Malcolm barely blinked. Suspicion is not probable cause. You violated the Constitution tonight. Each word was a gavel strike, measured and final. You could almost hear the echoes slide off the wet brick walls. Around me, the crowd caught fire. A man near the corner shouted first justice, another voice answered justice, and then the whole block joined a pulsing call and response that filled the street. Justice, justice. It sounded less like chanting and more like a verdict being spoken out loud. Jordan stayed still through it all, but something changed in the way he breathed. The boy who'd been pressed silent against the cruiser now seemed to stand inside that silence like it was armor. He wasn't frozen. He was choosing stillness, letting patience and presence speak louder than any outburst could. Elaine moved to his side, rain glinting in her hair. Her voice was clear and level, built on years of courtroom argument and long nights defending civil rights. This entire neighborhood witnessed your unlawful act, she said, pointing not with a finger, but with the weight of every glowing phone around us. Her words carried a kind of quiet inevitability. Mrs. Laverne Howard leaned even farther from her window, phone lifted like a torch. The world is watching, she called. It wasn't a slogan. It was a fact, and it traveled fast. People repeated it up and down the block, on porches and doorways, into live feeds and open mics, until it was less a sentence than a current running through the night. Doyle's eyes darted from the cameras to Malcolm, then to the younger officer still standing rigid behind him. Every twitch betrayed the shrinking room he had left to move in. His authority was no longer the loudest thing on the street. The Constitution was. The chant grew stronger, echoing off rain-slicked brick and metal. Justice, justice, a single word doubled and tripled, bouncing between neighbors and strangers, until it felt like the whole neighborhood had become a courtroom. Through it all, Jordan held his silence. He wasn't a bystander in his own rescue, he was its center. You could see him understand right there under the streetlight that dignity isn't always a shout. Sometimes it's the quiet choice to stay unshaken while truth gathers its witnesses. Malcolm never stepped back. Elaine never dropped her gaze. And the world phones up eyes wide kept recording every second, turning a wet D.C. block into a living testimony that would outlast the storm. The street had turned into a living courtroom by the time new sirens sliced through the night. More police units rolled in 3, then 4, painting the wet brick in streaks of blue and red. Their engines idled at the edge of the block, lights pulsing like a heartbeat, but none of the officers stepped forward. They opened doors, conferred in low voices, and stayed put. You could feel the hesitation, as if everyone understood this wasn't an ordinary stop anymore. One wrong move could land on every screen in America. Justice Malcolm Miles seemed to read the moment as easily as the rain. He took out his phone and spoke with a calm that carried even over the chanting crowd. Send the Supreme Court legal team here, he instructed. Secure all footage. Archive every witness recording. He moved like a man who knew procedure better than panic, pausing only to confirm street names and timestamps. You could almost see the chain of custody being built in real time, a legal wall rising as steady as the drizzle. Meanwhile, Officer Doyle's authority leaked away with each second. His jaw clenched, but his hands betrayed him. I watched his fingers tremble as he fumbled with the handcuffs, finally sliding them off Jordan's wrists. The metallic click sounded louder than the earlier sirens. His eyes kept darting from the boy he had pinned to the phones, ringing the scene, to the black SUV that still hummed like a sealed verdict. Whatever script he'd planned for the night was gone. Jordan didn't rub his wrists or shrink back. He simply stepped to his father's side, back straight, eyes forward. The boy who had begun this evening with a quiet walk home now stood like someone ready to give testimony. He didn't need to speak. You could read the new gravity in the set of his shoulders and the steadiness of his breath. Silence wasn't a shield anymore. It had become a statement. Above us, Mrs. Laverne Howard pushed her window wider and leaned out, rain streaking her cheek. She lifted her phone like a banner and called down, "The whole neighborhood is watching, officer." Her voice carried through the block with a strength that surprised even her. People on the sidewalks picked it up, repeating the words, until they formed a chant that rolled over the roofs and back again. The whole neighborhood is watching. Phones swung higher, lights flaring brighter, until the street looked lit from inside. The glow spilled onto every badge and every wet patch of pavement, an unbroken ring of witness. It wasn't just observation anymore. It was participation. What had begun as a rescue was turning into evidence, and everyone there understood the difference. Malcolm raised a hand for quiet. The chant softened to a low murmur, but didn't die. He glanced at Jordan, then at the crowd, then back to Doyle. "Every second of tonight is documented," he said, voice calm, but heavy. "Nothing disappears. Nothing is lost." Doyle's reply was barely a whisper. "Yes, sir." The younger officers kept their distance, radios crackling. As they awaited instructions, none of them wanted to give. The rain kept falling, but now it felt like punctuation, soft periods in a sentence the night was writing for history. Around me, neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder, phones, steady faces lifted. The light from those screens joined in the air until it looked like hundreds of small torches lining the block. That's when it struck me how quickly the scene had changed shape. Minutes ago, we were bystanders in a confrontation. Now the crowd itself had become a wall of accountability, a living archive that no badge or weather could erase. And in the center of that circle, father, mother, son, stood the reason we had all stayed, the reason we kept filming, the reason no one would step back, the conviction that justice once called into the open has to be witnessed to survive. By sunrise, the storm had turned digital. What began as a ring of neighbors with raised phones had become a tide of screens across the country. Before I even poured coffee, the first video from Maple and Fifth sat pinned at the top of every feed. A single clip, less than 2 minutes long, showed a boy pressed to a cruiser, a Supreme Court justice, stepping through the rain, and 3 quiet words, "Release my son." The numbers sprinted past comprehension. Millions of views before the city's streetlights blinked off. Justice for Jordan trended first, followed by Meagher, Fourth Amendment rights, and Maple and Fifth. Each tag pulled more eyes, more comments, more echoes of that midnight verdict. Strangers were quoting Malcolm Miles's words like they were case law. Overnight, our neighborhood block had become a headline the size of a nation. By mid-morning, the mayor was on camera, his tie slightly crooked, as if he hadn't slept. He called the incident deeply troubling, demanded a full investigation, and promised an independent review before the week was out. Reporters shouted questions about officer suspensions and body cam policy, their voices overlapping until the feed cut away. An hour later, the D.C. Police Department issued a formal statement of apology and pledged a transparent and swift inquiry. The words were careful, but the urgency leaked through every line. Inside, the Miles home action moved even faster. Malcolm and Elaine had been through enough courtrooms to know a public statement wasn't protection. Before dawn, they were at their kitchen table with laptops open, building the case that would outlast a single press cycle. Malcolm drafted affidavits while Elaine contacted civil rights colleagues asking for affidavits and expert testimony. They weren't just shielding their son. They were laying the first stones of a federal civil rights lawsuit meant to guard every family without the shield of a Supreme Court title. Jordan sat across from them, quiet at first. He traced a droplet of water around his mug and kept seeing the night in flashes, the flashlights, the cold hood of the car, Doyle's voice inches from his ear. But another thought pressed harder. He pictured classmates from Lincoln High who walked home the same way he had kids whose parents didn't wear robes or argue before justices. He thought of friends stopped for nothing but a hoodie or a bike ride after dark. "I keep wondering," he said finally, voice low, "what happens to them when no one's father shows up?" Elaine reached across the table and caught his hand. "That's why we don't stop at an apology," she said. Malcolm nodded, eyes steady. "We'll use every tool we have. This isn't just for us." Outside their living room window, the story kept racing. National outlets picked up the video in waves. Morning anchors spoke the family's name with the kind of reverence usually reserved for historic cases. Legal analysts broke down the difference between suspicion and probable cause. Civil rights lawyers quoted the Fourth Amendment on live TV. By afternoon, major newspapers ran banner headlines: "Supreme Court Justice confronts local police over unlawful stop." Cable networks replayed the clip of Malcolm's calm declaration until it felt etched into the day under the Fourth Amendment. "You need probable cause. Show it. Now." Every replay brought fresh calls for reform, for oversight, for a change in how the law meets the street. Back on Maple and Fifth, The evidence never cooled. Neighbors emailed raw video to attorneys and journalists. Students built a website to host the footage before anyone could claim it was doctored. Even the corner store where someone had shouted the first justice printed photos for anyone who needed them. What had started as witnesses had hardened into record keepers. Jordan watched some of the coverage, but not all. He walked the block with his father that afternoon, pointing to the exact patch of wet pavement where he had stood silent. He realized the spot wasn't just memory, it was now part of a case file, a point of reference in a national conversation. And he understood, maybe more than he wished to, that his silence that night hadn't been only for survival. It had become an argument in itself, proof that dignity can be its own form of testimony. By evening, live trucks lined Maple Street. Reporters spoke under umbrellas while neighbors waved from porches. Headlines stretched across every screen I owned. But the heart of the story never moved a teenager who kept his calm, a father who arrived like the law itself, a community that refused to look away. And as the day folded into dusk, you could feel it, the sense that this wasn't just a single night in one city. It was a beginning, and the country was already listening. I was there the morning the city let the light in. The council chamber filled early benches, tight aisles lined a quiet that had weight to it. Mrs. Laverne Howard sat 2 rows ahead in her Sunday coat, a small notebook on her lap, with the time, the street, and the badge number written twice. When the clerk called the first witness, the room leaned forward as one. They began with the videos. No edits, no voiceover, just the cold truth of a wet night on Maple and Fifth. We watched Doyle's flashlight hit Jordan's face. We heard the order hands where I can see them now, and the layered questions. We heard the small sounds nobody forgets. Fabric scraping metal breath, fogging the hood rain on steel. Then the words that crossed the country in hours, release my son. Each clip came from a different phone, a different angle, but the story never shifted. Reality doesn't need a second take. Mrs. Howard took the stand after the third video. She lifted her hands, swore in, and spoke like she was reading a clean ledger. Window up, phone out. 911 called. Mind your own business, said to her face. The moment the street became a circle of witnesses, no drama added, none required. The facts carried themselves. Others followed the corner store cashier, the mail carrier, the teenager with the pizza box who named the time and place into his camera. One by one, their accounts locked together until the floor of the room felt level. When the last video ended, nobody clapped. Nobody needed to. We had all seen the same night from enough directions to trust what it was. Findings came sooner than anyone predicted. The chair spoke plainly. Officer Greg Doyle was suspended without pay, pending criminal charges for unlawful detention and use of excessive force. The U.S. Attorney's Office would pursue prosecution pending full review of the record. Department policy reviews would begin at once. The words didn't sound like a promise thrown at the wind. They sounded like doors finally closing behind a man who had walked past too many open ones. Outside, microphones multiplied. Reporters went live. Legal analysts explained the gap between suspicion and probable cause. And then the dominoes started to fall. A city council 3 states away scheduled an emergency session on stop and frisk. Another announced a timeline for mandatory release of body cam footage after force incidents. Training memoranda were updated not because one family asked, but because 1,000 recordings left no room for doubt. Jordan didn't rush to the cameras. It was late afternoon when he finally spoke, son, laying a clean stripe across the courthouse steps. He stood between his parents' shoulders, easy voice even. Silence protected my dignity, he said. Courage spoke when it had to. It wasn't a slogan. It was how the night had unfolded. The sentence moved fast, printed on placards in Detroit, quoted by a civics teacher, to a room of 9th graders, repeated by a grandmother into her church group's phone tree. I heard it later from a bus driver who'd watched the clip on his break and blamed the wind for his eyes. Back on Maple and 5th, the block looked ordinary again. Cars, groceries, work to get to. But it felt changed. The corner store taped a copy of the 4th Amendment by the register. The bodega kid kept Mrs. Howard's testimony behind the counter like a keepsake. Neighbors who were strangers a month ago nodded like family now. The place that had narrowed to a boy and a badge had widened into a memory the city would have to live with. I saw Malcolm and Elaine as the crowd thinned. They weren't celebrating. They were steady people who know one victory isn't an ending. But when Jordan glanced over their faces, softened in a way that needed no words, pride, without possessions, relief without forgetting. They had done what parents try to do in a world that doesn't always help them stand up, stand in, and then make room for the truth to stand on its own. As for Doyle, the machinery will move arraignment motions hearings. None of us can script that ending. What we wrote together was something else, a line the city can't cross without admitting it. A record too consistent to ignore. A reminder that the law belongs on the street as much as it does on paper. And when the microphones packed up and the evening settled over Maple Street, what remained after verdicts and headlines was the quiet work of carrying that truth home and living by it. By the time morning found us, the storm had rinsed the city clean. I stopped at the corner before work and looked down Maple the way you look at a place that surprised you, like it could still say something you hadn't heard yet. Later that day, I walked a block over to drop a note at Mrs. Howard's and passed the Miles house without meaning to. The porch light was off. The door was half open to the air. On the front steps, a pair of wet shoes waited for sun. I didn't see the moment itself, but I can tell you how it must have looked. Malcolm and Jordan stood on their porch side by side in shirt sleeves. Morning laid a clean stripe across the street. The light had that exact softness you only get after rain, the kind that makes every color look honest. They didn't talk at first. They didn't have to. There's a language that happens when a father and son stare out at the same block and both know what it took to get back to this ordinary hour. When Malcolm finally spoke, it wasn't a speech. He turned slightly, not taking his eyes off the neighborhood, and said the kind of sentence that fits into a pocket for later. The fight for justice never ends. But you stood tall, and that matters. I can hear it because I've heard him in other rooms, measured, certain, careful with words the way you're careful with sharp tools. On the porch, it landed different. It wasn't a verdict. It was permission to be proud without pretending the work was finished. Jordan nodded. He didn't puff up or play it down. He took it in like he knew the difference between a compliment and a charge. He kept looking at the street where everything had happened, the bend in Maple, the place the lights hit the pavement, the view toward the corner store, where a copy of the Fourth Amendment now sat taped beside the gum. And you could almost see the thought form in him that the law doesn't live only in marble halls or on paper. It lives here, too, in the ordinary ways we carry ourselves, when no one is recording, in the choices a kid makes to keep his voice steady when the night wants him to break. News crews had thinned by then, but the story hadn't. The papers called it a night that woke a country. Some said it was a turning point. Others said it was a mirror. New policies were drafted, old ones were dusted off and actually enforced. City councils debated specifics that used to die in committee. A training memo became a law 2 states away. None of it fixed everything. All of it meant something. You could feel the difference in how people talked at the bus stop, and how neighbors learned each other's names, and how the corner store cashier reminded kids to keep their cameras charged, not because he expected trouble, but because he expected truth. When I think of that morning, I think of small things that hold big weight. The way Elaine stepped out with 2 mugs and handed one to each of them, then leaned against the frame and watched without hovering. The way Jordan rolled his shoulders once like a man putting a heavy coat back on, but deciding it fits. The way Malcolm listened to the quiet, not filling it with authority, just letting the house and the block tell him they were still standing. A breeze came through and lifted the flag at the end of the street, just a modest one, nothing oversized. It caught, fell, then rose into a slow, steady wave. Jordan watched it for a long beat. He didn't salute. He didn't cry. He let the sight meet whatever was in him and settle there. I don't know what he said to himself, but if I had to guess, I'd say he believed a little deeper that the country is both promise and practice, and that his part, anyone's part, is to keep the two as close as possible. I walked on, left my note with Mrs. Howard, and circled back toward Maple. The block sounded like a block, again delivery trucks, the distant clink of a bottle bin, a dog deciding who was worth barking at. Ordinary is not nothing. Ordinary is what justice is supposed to deliver back to people who had it taken. I think that's what the porch gave them that day, a way to belong to morning without forgetting the night. If you were expecting a brass band ending, you missed what made the story bearable. It didn't close with a roar. It closed with a direction. The cameras packed up. The hashtags slid down the feed. But the work stayed in the neighborhood, inside kitchens and on sidewalks, and in the rhythm of how we greet each other. That's how change keeps from being a headline. It becomes a habit. Before I turned the corner, I looked back once more. Jordan had stepped off the porch and down onto the walk, the exact route he'd taken so many evenings before. He didn't rush. He didn't linger. He glanced at the flag again and then passed it toward a day that needed doing. For the first time since the sirens split the night, he looked simply like a kid on his street with a home to leave and return to, and a future he understood he had a claim on. I kept moving because that's what days ask. But I carried his father's words with me like a folded card in a wallet. The fight doesn't end, and standing tall matters. I carried Jordan's lesson too, the one he taught the whole block without raising his voice, that dignity can outlast a bad night and courage can be quiet and still count. And if there has to be a last line to all this, let it be the one that held the street steady when everything wanted to tip. Silence can protect dignity. Courage speaks when it must. What a night and what a reminder. This story isn't only about a father's courage or a son's quiet strength. It's about the power of community, of dignity held firm, and of justice that begins on an ordinary street and grows until a nation must listen. Jordan's silence became a shield. His family's resolve turned into change for millions. If this journey moved you, please like this video and share it with someone who believes in fairness and courage. Your support keeps Mr. Mac's Stories creating powerful, true-to-life narratives that shine a light on justice and hope. Every click, every share helps us bring more stories like this to life, stories that remind us all that silence can protect dignity and courage speaks when it must. Let's carry that spirit forward together.